Empires rarely default out loud. A declaration of bankruptcy is an admission of failure. Credibility, once lost, cannot be recovered. So great powers do not announce their insolvency. They default silently. The burden is transferred, not erased. It shifts to citizens, to trading partners, to allies. The system is preserved. The public pays the price. This is the silent default pattern. It is not an accident. It is a mechanism. The pattern repeats across centuries. The method changes, but the core logic does not. In the 1500s, Habsburg Spain, rich with New World silver, found its commitments outstripped its resources. It diluted its coinage, a primitive form of inflation, to pay its debts. In the 18th century, Bourbon France, crippled by war and aristocratic excess, experimented with paper money that quickly became worthless. In 1931, and again in 1949, the British Empire, exhausted by 2 world wars, devalued the pound sterling. It was a surgical default on its global obligations, disguised as a currency adjustment. The United States has navigated multiple internal cycles, most notably in 1933 and 1971. Each instance was presented as a necessary reform. Each was a form of silent default. The tools evolve. The outcome remains the same. Every silent default follows a predictable sequence. This is the architecture of managed decline. The cycle begins with excess spending. It is channeled into military expansion, vast welfare systems, or the costs of imperial administration. The spending soon outpaces revenue. Debt becomes the engine of the state. Borrowing is no longer a tool for emergencies. It becomes a structural necessity. As debt expands, the currency comes under strain. Trust begins to erode, or inflation begins to rise. Foreign creditors, sensing this credibility risk, start to reduce their exposure. They sell the debt. They seek alternatives. This forces a policy intervention. The state must act, but it cannot admit the true nature of the problem. It announces a reset, a reform, a new economic paradigm. In reality, it is a wealth transfer. The value is moved from the public to the issuer of the debt. The final step is narrative reframing. The crisis is blamed on external forces, on greedy speculators, on unregulated markets. The government presents itself as the solution, not the cause. This 7-stage process is not chaos. It is a structured, rational response to an insoluble problem. To execute this, states deploy a specific set of tools. These are the hidden instruments of silent default. The first and most common is inflation. By debasing the currency, the government shrinks the real value of its outstanding debt. It is a stealth tax, levied on savers and wage earners whose purchasing power quietly evaporates. The second tool is currency devaluation. This is an explicit reduction of the currency's exchange rate against others, or against a commodity like gold. It makes exports cheaper, but more importantly, it reduces the burden of debts owed to foreigners. Britain used this tool twice in 20 years to escape the gravity of its post-war liabilities. The third instrument is financial repression. This is a subtle, coercive strategy. The government forces its own citizens and domestic institutions to hold its debt. This is achieved through regulation, capital controls, or artificially low interest rate ceilings. Savers are trapped, their capital conscripted to fund the state's deficits at below-market rates. The fourth tool is controlled monetary expansion, often called quantitative easing. The central bank creates new money to buy government bonds, absorbing debt that the private market can no longer stomach. The process is presented as a technical, monetary operation. In function, it is the nationalization of unpayable liabilities. The central bank's balance sheet becomes a repository for the state's fiscal failures. The fifth and most profound tool is changing the monetary standard itself. This is the ultimate reset. The shift from a gold standard to a paper standard, from fixed paper to floating fiat, or from fiat to a future digital currency. Each transition redefines the rules of the game. It breaks old promises and resets obligations without ever using the word default. Nixon's closing of the gold window in 1971 was precisely this, a change in the fundamental nature of money to escape an unbreakable promise. These 5 tools are the machinery of silent collapse. Empires choose this path for structural reasons. The incentives are overwhelming. An open default would shatter imperial credibility, the foundation of geopolitical influence. It would trigger panic and catastrophic capital flight. destabilizing the domestic political order. A silent default, by contrast, preserves the illusion of stability. It allows the empire to maintain its influence, keep foreign creditors compliant, and avoid direct, messy negotiations. By reframing the problem, the state rewrites its obligations unilaterally. The process is managed from the center, insulated from democratic accountability or market discipline. A silent default is not an economic accident. It is a political tool chosen by a rational, self-preserving elite to manage an otherwise terminal decline. These historical parallels serve as mirrors for the present. When Habsburg Spain faced bankruptcy from its endless wars, it systematically diluted the silver content of its coins. The debt, denominated in those coins, was effectively erased. When the British Empire could no longer service the debts from its global conflicts, it severed the pound's link to gold and devalued it, defaulting on its creditors in a single, decisive act. The Soviet Union, in its final years, ran a dual exchange rate system, an official rate for the state and a black market rate for everyone else. This was a way to disguise the ruble's true, collapsed value. The cleanest silent default in modern history occurred on August 15, 1971. The United States unilaterally ended the international convertibility of the dollar to gold. This single decision dismantled the Bretton Woods system and defaulted on the promise that had underpinned the global monetary order for a generation. Each case reveals the same mechanism. Debt exceeds the productive capacity of the system. The currency becomes the release valve. Today, the United States fits the characteristics of a system in stage 5 of the pattern: policy intervention. This is not a prediction of imminent collapse. It is a structural observation. The symptoms are visible. Government debt relative to GDP is at historic highs and continues to rise. The real purchasing power of the currency is in a state of managed decline. Major foreign creditors, from China to Japan, are steadily reducing their exposure to U.S. Treasury bonds. The system has become deeply reliant on the Federal Reserve's monetary expansion to absorb government debt. We see the early stages of financial repression, with discussions about forcing pension funds or banks to hold more government debt. Globally, rival powers are actively building alternative payment networks to bypass the dollar system. The architecture of the present moment mirrors other empires at this critical stage of the silent default cycle. The system is under strain, and the state is intervening not to fix the fundamental imbalance, but to manage its consequences. The public does not experience this as a macroeconomic event. A silent default is invisible from within. Instead, citizens perceive its effects as the texture of daily life becoming more difficult. They see it as persistent, high prices for groceries and fuel. They feel it as wages that never seem to keep up. They witness housing becoming unattainable for an entire generation. They watch their savings erode quietly, their value eaten away by an inflation rate that always seems higher than the official figures. Investment returns become distorted, driven not by productive enterprise, but by the flow of central bank liquidity. People find it harder to maintain the living standards they once took for granted. This is not a series of isolated problems. It is the transfer of the system's imbalance onto the population. The state's debt becomes the citizen's hardship. The default is not an event. It is a process. There will be no single moment, no headline in the news declaring the default. There will be no official declaration. A silent default is a slow, grinding transfer of wealth that unfolds over years, even decades. It only becomes visible in retrospect. Years from now, historians will look back. They will identify the period when the currency regime fundamentally shifted. They will pinpoint the years when the real value of the nation's debt burden quietly dissolved, paid for by the loss of public purchasing power. The default happens in plain sight, yet it remains unseen by most, disguised as the new normal. This reveals the larger pattern behind all such episodes. Empires do not collapse because they run out of money. They have central banks. They can create infinite amounts of it. Empires collapse because they run out of mechanisms to hide the fact that the money they are creating no longer has sufficient value. They run out of credibility. Silent defaults are the last viable tools. They are the final, sophisticated strategies employed to keep the system functioning, to extend the cycle, and to manage the inevitable transition. It is the last stage of a system before it is forced to become something new.